Hi there. Today we're going to talk about 3 different books. They're not going to be in-depth book reviews, they're going to be 3 books that you should consider buying if you are a coffee professional. First on that list is a book by Timothy Hill and Getu Bekele, and it is a reference guide to Ethiopian coffee varieties. And it is exactly what it says it is. It is a page-by-page guide of all the different catalogued varieties in Ethiopia. It is beautifully illustrated. There's some great diagrams in there explaining the absurdity and complexity of the genetics of Arabica coffee. And beyond that, individual descriptions of different varieties catalogued in Ethiopia. Now, from the beginning, this book does something extremely interesting. It makes me feel extremely uncomfortable about how I've talked about coffee from Ethiopia in the last decade of my career. It's made me extremely uncomfortable for using the term heirloom varieties in reference to Ethiopian coffees because it's a bad term and more than likely it's incorrect. Because as a coffee industry, we often talk about Ethiopian coffee as if it's this kind of wild, coffee varieties there. They're just, nature has taken over, whereas in the rest of the world, there's a lot more selection going on. People are typically planting Typica or Bourbon. Ethiopia, it's all sorts of everything. It's just natural and crazy and wonderful, and it's so diverse and interesting. And the truth is somewhat different, and I feel like this book probably should change the conversations we have about varieties in Ethiopia. It's split into roughly 3 sections, and the first section is probably the most important one to discuss here. It talks about the work of the Jimma Agricultural Research Center, which I think founded in 1967, has been cataloguing, selecting, improving varieties for Ethiopian coffee farmers. And a lot of the varieties that we know, and certainly varieties that have traveled outside of Ethiopia, are relevant to the work done here. The second section is discussing what we might call land races, varieties that have distinctly evolved within geographic areas. And it covers 3 different areas in Ethiopia and the land races selected, typically grown in those kind of areas. And the third section covers coffee varieties that have left Ethiopia, most notably Geisha or Gesha, and it discusses the split between Panamanian Geisha and what we see out of Malawi and how that sort of happened and why that split happened, as well as other varieties like Wush Wush. This is, I think, an extremely useful reference text if you are someone buying coffee, but also if you're someone selling or communicating coffee. We've sort of allowed this term heirloom to sort of invade our descriptions, and I think we've sold the work of coffee producers short, and I think we've denied something in the way of detail or interest to consumers when we use that term. I'm guilty, as anyone is. If I'm going to point the finger, I'm going to point it at me, but I will be working very hard to never really use that term again in reference to Ethiopian coffees. It's flawed, it's inaccurate, it's poorly defined, and it's sort of most of the time probably just wrong. If you want to buy this, it is a little bit difficult right now to get in Europe. I will leave the best possible link down below. None of the links below will be affiliate links. They'll just be the best links I can get you to buy those wherever in the world you are. If you're in the US, it's pretty easy to buy, and there'll definitely be a link there. So whether you're buying, whether you're selling, I think there's something interesting here for you. Second book. It is primarily the work of Dr. Aaron Davis. He, I think, became pretty widely known within the coffee industry. I think 5 or 6 years ago now, he did a fantastic talk at the SCAA Symposium, now known as RICO, that I'll link to down below. That's a superb talk, and I recommend that highly. And he's done an enormous amount of work. Now, he works at the Royal Botanical Gardens here in London over at Kew Gardens, and this book is published by Kew. This book is an atlas in the purest sense. Now, the atlas accurately maps Ethiopia, and it covers not just where coffee grows, but also how well it grows. So different coffee growing areas are described in terms of whether they're fair, good, or excellent for growing coffee. But it's an atlas, almost like a road atlas. You can navigate your way around Ethiopia to some extent with this book. It covers roads, rail, major roads, minor roads. There's an enormous amount of detail here. at first glance, unless you're a coffee buyer, that's probably not hugely useful to you unless, like me, you just desperately love maps. And good Lord, I love maps. There are plenty of other sections in the book that are interesting, though it is written by someone who understands the coffee industry, but not necessarily for the broader coffee industry. There's more detail on botanical aspects of coffee than there are perhaps on typical washing and fermentation practices within the area, something that you may, as a coffee person want to know more about, and the botanical aspects of coffee may interest you a little bit less. There are some other fantastic maps and displays of information in the book. Seeing monthly rainfall distribution in Ethiopia or monthly temperature was kind of fascinating to me. And throughout, it's extremely well written. It's written by someone who has written well and academically. So, it's a pretty intense book. It's definitely not a book aimed at consumers, and it's kind of aimed at a sort of interesting section of the coffee industry. That said, am I glad I bought it? Absolutely. I'm happy to support him, but also I think it's a beautiful piece of work that must have taken staggering amounts of time, energy, and effort. And for that alone, just blown away. The third book I'm going to talk about today, just briefly, is a book by Ryan Brown called Dear Coffee Buyer, A Guide to Sourcing Green Coffee. I haven't been particularly critical of the first two books, and I'm not going to be particularly critical of this one. I'll be honest, I really enjoyed this book. I think Ryan writes extremely well. My criticism might be something that you're thinking right now, which is that cover doesn't grab me. And I'll be honest, the cover, I think, sells the book a tiny bit short. The book looks a little less serious than it kind of is. And I'm not saying it's serious in a kind of overly earnest or dry and boring way, because it's not. It's actually an extremely easy and enjoyable read. The book cover just gave me this moment of doubt. And if it's giving you a moment of doubt, overcome those doubts, because I think you should probably buy this book. Now, being a coffee buyer is considered kind of one of the holy grail positions in the coffee industry. And I certainly think that's a frustrating way of thinking. I think the idea that's success, I think, is a destructive and unhelpful narrative. But it is a job done by an enormous number of different people now that there are so many different companies roasting coffee. And this is written for you whether you are buying enormous amounts of coffee, container after container after container, or actually if you're just buying spot from a local importer, you are still a coffee buyer. And there's things in here you should be thinking about. It is full of great advice. I found myself very, very rarely, if ever, actually disagreeing with Ryan on anything he'd written in there. I learned something. I think anyone who's a coffee buyer will learn something, not just from Ryan, but there's also a few short interviews with a wide range of other buyers right at the back of the book. So if you want to be a coffee buyer, you should probably buy it. If you are a coffee buyer, you should probably buy it. You should never stop learning. I think that's a huge, challenge in the coffee industry for people who get to that particular role, and why you might be learning enormous amounts about coffee itself. I think it's hard to have the kind of professional development often in that role, because it's seen as a pinnacle. It's seen as a point of achievement, not as a stage in a journey, in a career. So I think if you're buying coffee, buying raw coffee, it's definitely worth buying. If you're interested in that as a career path, I think it's worth buying and reading. Though, if you find yourself getting a little bit bored by some of the detail, if that doesn't appeal to you, if you just like the idea of coffee tourism for a living, probably don't be a coffee buyer. Now, perhaps less with the third book here, but definitely with the first two books, there is a note of caution, and that's really down to you, the reader of these books. These kind of things weren't available for me early in my career, but nonetheless, I bought staggering amounts of coffee books. I bought just about everything I could find. I trawled eBay. I just wanted to collect knowledge. And I didn't understand that what I was collecting was information, and in learning that information, I was really gaining trivia. Right? I would do well in a quiz about these things. And actually, if you want to ace Peter Giuliano's little online quizzes of, is it an Ethiopian coffee variety or a Star Wars character, then yes, this is a great book to win that game. But when you buy books like these, when you read books like these, the key thing here is that you must transform that information into knowledge through its application. How you communicate with people, how you communicate with your team members, how you communicate with your customers. If you can take this information and leverage it to make what you do more meaningful, what people buy and drink more meaningful, then it has become useful knowledge. And a lot of the times people will buy these books, flick through them, and just leave them alone, right? They barely get used even as reference text. They're not really consumed that way because they're not thinking about that question. They're not thinking about how do I take this information and transform it into something desperately useful to me, my peers, my customers. That's really the thing. Both of these books on Ethiopia are full to the brim with information. And just be wary, just be thoughtful before you buy it, that you need to be involved in a process of transformation here. And actually, I think this book Ryan's book is a great lens through which to see this information. One thing that's pretty notable, there is very, very little crossover in information between these three books. Not much of what's covered in the Atlas is present in the Varieties reference guide. And while varieties are discussed in Dear Coffee Buyer, not nearly in the same way or detail or tone as they are in the reference guide. So there you go. Those are 3 books now available to you as coffee professionals or as potentially interested coffee consumers, but these are really geared to the coffee industry, and I hope at least one of them takes your fancy. They are all clearly the result of enormous amounts of hard work that I know how difficult that work is, and I have nothing but respect for it. I think they're great books, and I hope you buy them if you've bought them. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Are you enjoying it? Do you have questions? Let me know. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.